Richard Ravitch built some of New York City's most notable buildings, cleaned up its notorious public transportation agency, helped the city escape financial ruin, and served as lieutenant governor in the wake of the Elliot Spitzer scandal. Recently, Ravitch was chosen to help assess the viability of the city of Detroit's restructuring plan. He was also co-chairman with Paul Volcker of the State Budget Crisis Task Force. America's federal, state, and local governments are now grappling with the same financial problems New York overcame decades ago. Richard Ravitch's new memoir, So Much to Do, A Full Life of Business, Politics, and Confronting Fiscal Crises, explains how to do the hard work required to save those economies. Richard Ravitch appears in conversation tonight with David Crane, former special advisor to Governor Arnold Schwarzenegger, lecturer in public policy at Stanford University, and president of Govern for California. Please join me in welcoming them both to the JCCSF.
Barbara, thank you. And Dick, thank you for traveling to California to meet with us tonight. So the title of Dick's book, as you know, is So Much to Do. And as you already have heard from Barbara, Dick has done so much in his life, and I only have 50 minutes in which to ask my 10 questions. So we're going to get right to it, and then we're going to have 20 minutes of Q&A. So start thinking about your questions. I just want to start first by how I met Dick 5 years ago. I was special advisor to Governor Schwarzenegger, and one day, Governor Schwarzenegger, his secretary called me to say that Paul Volcker had called the governor and would like him to call him back. So Arnold wanted me to call up Paul Volcker back. So I did cartwheels back to my office because Paul Volcker had been a hero of mine anyway, and I was looking forward to having a conversation with Paul. I called up Paul, and he said he wanted to understand how it was in 2009 when the state of California was reporting a massive deficit. This was the year after the market crash, and California's revenues are largely related to capital gains, and the stock market had crashed, so California's revenues were down 30%. The state had a massive deficit, and yet we were in the market to borrow billions of dollars. And Paul Volcker wanted to know how it was that California could borrow money when it was reporting such a large deficit. So he went into the office of his longtime friend Dick Ravitch. They shared offices in New York. They share offices in New York. And Dick said to Paul, well, why don't you call Governor Schwarzenegger and ask him? So Paul calls, I return the call, and I explain to Paul how it is that a state can borrow money even when it's got massive deficits, which I won't bore you with right now, but we'll get into that in just a moment. And he said, well, you have to speak to my friend Dick Ravitch. So I then spoke to Dick Ravitch, and I found that I had another hero, not just Paul Volcker, after a 15-minute conversation with Dick Ravitch. So with that, let's get into the first questions that I have for Dick. Dick, in your book, which by the way is a fantastic read, especially for anybody who is interested in New York and New York politics, you studied at Columbia in the 1950s. Dick got his undergraduate degree at Columbia and his law degree at Yale. And you studied under, among others, Lionel Trilling, Richard Hofstadter, William Leuchtenberg, Henry Still-Commager, and more great scholars of the day. What were the issues of the day in the early 1950s at Columbia?
Well, there was a senator by the name of Joe McCarthy who was accusing every liberal of being a communist, and that was a big issue for the in a community like New York. But it was a relatively passive time, in part because of the McCarthy era, and in part because Dwight Eisenhower was president of Columbia University when he ran for the presidency in 1952. But it was Columbia's greatest era, and whatever I learned about politics and democracy, I learned in hello, Seth. I learned in Columbia in those days.
And were the students, was it largely a liberal
No, the student body was very passive. I was co-chairman of Students for Stevenson in 1952, and it was hard to get 100 people to a rally. So it was not a time of great, it wasn't like the 60s where young people were on the streets marching for every conceivable cause.
And were the professors at Columbia all largely opposed to McCarthy's tactics?
Yes, I
Yeah.
think so. There was one professor I remember, a very famous professor, who was accused by McCarthy of being a communist, and he had held a press conference on the Columbia campus, and it attracted a fair number of reporters, and those of us in the student body who were sympathetic showed up to provide moral support. And he got up and he said, "I am not now, and I have never been a member of the Communist Party. I am not now, and I have never been a member of the Republican Party." And he walked off the stage. I'll never forget it.
Was speaking of students for Columbia Students for Stevenson, you were co-chairman of that organization, and that led to an interesting encounter with the former First Lady Eleanor Roosevelt. Can you tell us about that?
This was one of the great thrills of my life. We wrote a letter to Mrs. Roosevelt asking if she'd come speak at the rally, the Students for Stevenson rally. And to my surprise, we got an answer in the affirmative, and the letter said to call her secretary, which I did. And I don't know how I had the chutzpah to do this, but I said to the secretary, after we'd arranged a time for her to come up to Columbia, it was 2:00 in the afternoon. I said, "Might I take Mrs. Roosevelt to lunch?" And the secretary asked her, and she said she would be delighted. So I was, needless to say, thrilled. And I asked my mother whether or not she could recommend a restaurant for me to take Mrs. Roosevelt to, who lived then at 62nd Street. My mother gave me the name of a little French restaurant. And then I decided, well, I'm not going to go around hailing cabs with Mrs. Roosevelt. So I borrowed my mother's car, picked up Mrs. Roosevelt, went to the restaurant, and suddenly realized, was I going to find a garage? I mean, and I pulled up in front of the restaurant. I was prepared to have the car towed away and be fined $1,000 because I had to take her up to Columbia afterwards. But there was a doorman in the adjoining building who intuited my dilemma when Mrs. Roosevelt got out of the car, and he looked at me and he said, "Kid, I'll watch the car." And so it was a great thrill. She was an extraordinary woman, and she loved young people, and it was a memorable experience.
Well, after your military service, you took a job on Capitol Hill, as I understand it. You were on the Military Operations Subcommittee. But soon you started assisting a then congressman named Eugene McCarthy to advance civil rights legislation. And you stayed friendly with McCarthy, who then became a senator. And McCarthy asked you to help him get selected as Lyndon Johnson's running mate in 1964. Tell us about that effort, that experience, and the personalities involved.
Well, it was an effort that had only one constituent, and that was the president. And so I had built some apartment houses in Washington, and one of the many vacant apartments became the center of the quite silent Gene McCarthy for vice president campaign. And I got appointed as a delegate to the convention, which was in Atlantic City that year. And there was great speculation as to who Johnson was going to pick as a running mate. And McCarthy was actually quite close to Johnson, and he and his wife socialized with Lyndon Johnson and his wife. And Johnson's chief of staff, quite serendipitously, was and to this day is a very close friend of mine, Joe Califano. And so I had that contact, I don't want to bore you with the whole story, but basically, I was swimming with Gene McCarthy and his son on the day of where the president was going to be nominated, and somebody came running out of the motel. There was a motel in Brigantine, New Jersey, which was right near where near Atlantic City. And they said, Senator, the president's on the phone. So I ran in with Gene McCarthy. It was the only moment I was observer of a historic event. And Gene McCarthy picked up the phone, and Johnson obviously said to him he wasn't picking him, and he handed the phone, or McCarthy said to me, he's putting the House Jew on the phone, which startled me a little bit. The only person with Lyndon Johnson, when he was calling people to tell him who was not going to be vice president, was Arthur Goldberg, who Johnson subsequently got to resign from the Supreme Court and become ambassador to the United Nations. And many years later, when Arthur Goldberg ran for governor in New York State, I met him, and he was campaigning in the park, and I was pushing a baby carriage with my son, and I asked him, I said, why were you in the with the president? He said, I have no idea. He said, the president asked me to come to his office that morning, and as a Supreme Court justice, I wasn't involved in politics. He never asked my opinion. He made me sit there while he called Bobby Kennedy, Robert Wagner, a whole variety of people, and Gene McCarthy to tell them they weren't going to be the candidate. Well, he picked Humphrey, and Goldberg went on to tell me that a year later, Gene McCarthy was on the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, and Goldberg was then ambassador to the UN, and he needed a technical amendment to some law, and he asked to come to Washington and visit with the chairman of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, and McCarthy kept him waiting for 3 hours in his office.
You were at the March on Washington in 1963, where Dr. King delivered his I Have a Dream speech. Tell us about that day.
Well,
that
event. It was, I grew up in the city of New York. My parents sent me to a very progressive school. It was our family loved Franklin Roosevelt, so I had all these liberal roots, and my former wife and I went down and marched in Washington, and it was a thrilling experience. I mean, I'll never forget it. We were fairly close for serendipitous reasons, and I got to know King in later years when he came to New York, because he stayed at the home of people I knew. It was an exciting experience.
And Bayard Rustin, you got to know?
Well, I met Bayard Rustin, which led to a whole series of coincidental facts in my life. A. Philip Randolph, they had an office in the headquarters of the Teachers Union in New York, and I became friendly with the head of the Teachers Union, which proved to be very critical the day in October of 1975 when the city almost went bankrupt.
Well, we're going to come back to that in just a minute. But before we get to 1975, we have to stop at 1966, when after riots in a number of U.S. cities, President Johnson appointed you to the National Commission on Urban Problems, which was focused mainly on the housing issues that many believed were an underlying cause of a lot of the discontent manifested by the riots. Tell us about that effort, and more generally, I'm interested in your view on what would have been the outcome today in the United States if there had been no federal or state housing programs, subsidy programs, and that sort of thing.
Well, first, I can't help but recall that the National Commission on Urban Problems, this could never happen again, and I served subsequently on several other national commissions. I actually chaired the Millennium Housing Commission in 2000.
What's Millennium?
Yes, 2000, thank you.
Yeah.
And, but the commission in 1966, the National Commission on Urban Problems, had one mayor on it. He was the mayor of Arlington, Texas. And when I met him, I said, forgive me, I am not familiar with Arlington, Texas. and he said it's halfway between Dallas and Fort Worth, and it's the only city of the United States that does not have a single person on welfare. And I thought only only President Johnson could appoint a mayor to a National Commission on Urban Problems like that. Well, there were tons of programs that went right through the Nixon era as well. And actually, there was more subsidized housing built under Nixon than anybody else, because the full head of steam of the programs that were initiated in the Kennedy-Johnson years didn't really begin to have any arithmetic impact on the housing market until the 70s. And there are millions of units that were created with a variety of different kinds of subsidies, most of which are gone today. The only one that really exists to a limited degree is the low-income housing tax credit. So it's one of the reasons why there's so much pressure in the cities, and I know anecdotally that prices in your city have gone way up. In New York, they're astronomical. And it's very hard for a young family to find a place in a central city that they can afford.
Well, our mayor in San Francisco, I think, has just requested about $100 million for a housing effort. I don't know if you would call it a low-income housing effort, but a housing effort in San Francisco. I don't know if that'll move the needle or not, but...
Well, our new mayor has proposed a lot of it, too. I'm not sure the money's going to be forthcoming.
I'm glad you brought up Nixon, because young people today are not familiar with Republicans like, you know, in your era in New York. You know, John Lindsay was a Republican, Nelson Rockefeller, others who were very active in promoting housing problems and government activity, government intervention in a significant way. Very few people from the younger generation know that Nixon and his administration played the role that you just described, authored the Clean Air Act, the Clean Water Act, and other such things. Can you comment on the evolution of the Republican Party? First of all, are there any Republicans today that are like those Republicans then, that were not so afraid of government intervention and government activity?
I can only say I wish there were more, because I'm not overly happy with a lot of the Democrats either. But it was a different tradition, particularly in New York. Rockefeller cared, and I pointed this out in my book, he cared deeply about building housing for the poor, creating, expanding the institutions of higher education. He did a lot. He financed it all in a somewhat dubious way, which is why it all came apart in 1975. But his motivation was absolutely terrific, and so was Lindsay's. And even though in so many respects Nixon was viewed by Democrats as being an evil man, and he was I gather, a strange person. I only met him once. But it wasn't just what you described. Affirmative action came out of the Nixon administration. He created the National Endowment of the Arts and the National Endowment of the Humanities.
It's remarkable when you think about it.
It really was.
Well, let's go to
the thing he did that I ultimately was least attracted to was he wanted to close the Office of Economic Opportunity, which Johnson had created, was the part of the Great Society, the poverty program, and he wanted to close it. But Pat Moynihan, who was a dear friend of mine, urged him not to, said this was a very important institution and helping poor people was critically important, and the Head Start program was very useful thing in our society. So Nixon told Moynihan, all right, find me somebody to run it who is not going to make a lot of noise and demand a lot of money and put a lot of pressure on me. So Moynihan found out about a young congressman from Illinois who wanted to leave the Congress and go into the executive branch of the government. And his name was Donald Rumsfeld. And he had lunch with Rumsfeld, and he asked Rumsfeld if he would go in and run the OEO, and Rumsfeld said yes, on condition that he could bring his pal Dick Cheney in as his deputy. So in later years, Pat Moynihan regretted those choices, but that's how both Cheney and Rumsfeld got into the executive branch of the federal government.
So in 1975, you got a call from then Governor Hugh Carey asking for your help with New York City, which was running out of cash. The bank said they would.
No, the first thing that went broke was what was Rockefeller's favorite thing, which was the New York State Urban Development Corporation.
Start with that and then go on to the.
Well, the way Rockefeller financed all these good things was through something called a moral obligation bond. Since you could not pledge, and this is different from California, the full faith and credit of New York State without going to the voters weren't about to approve bond issues to help poor people. So Nelson Rockefeller hired a bond lawyer by the name of John Mitchell.
For those of you who don't know, John Mitchell was Nixon's Attorney General.
Ended up in the Hooskow. But he created.
Hooskow was New York speak for jail.
Well, I thought it was universal. At any rate, Mitchell came up with this idea of a moral obligation bond, which was a lot of nonsense, but Wall Street loved it, and they issued billions of dollars of moral obligation bonds. And in 1975, when Carey became governor, the banks went to him and said, look, these public benefit corporations don't have any revenues. You better start appropriating money. And Carey said, well, why didn't you require that when Rockefeller was still governor? Well, like, blah, 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 blah. And so he asked me to come in and save it from bankruptcy, which I was able to do. But the story I like to tell about all of it was my first real participation in public life. And one of the first times I was up in Albany, the capital of New York State, and I'm in a bar at night, and there were a bunch of people talking, and including some reporters. And a young reporter from the New York Times said to me, what do you really think of Nelson Rockefeller? And I said, he's a cross between Ponzi and Robin Hood. And the next day, that was the quote of the day in the New York Times. And that's how I learned the difference between on the record and off the record. And I remember getting a call from a professor of mine at law school who I had become friendly with, who called me up and he said, Ravitch, says, you're still a young pisher, and he's vice president of the United States. Keep your damn mouth shut. Anyway, and then on May 2nd, and this is another good story, we had refinanced the Urban Development Corporation, was then able to continue and build about 30,000 units of affordable housing. And I got a call from Hugh Carey's secretary one morning saying that Mr. Riston, who was head of Citibank, and Mr. Patterson, who was head of the Morgan Bank, Mr. Butcher, who was president of Chase, were coming to see the governor at 2:30, and she associated me with banks, and she thought I ought to be there. So I said, the governor asked for me to be there, and she said no. And she said, I haven't spoken to him. I just called the police detail to find out if he would be back in his office by 2:30. So I wandered over there, and 2:30, the three bankers who looked very glum and I walked in the governor's office, sat down, and Walter Riston said to Hugh Carey, we are here regretfully to tell you we will no longer underwrite the notes and bonds of the city of New York. And there was absolute silence. And I said effective when, and they said effective immediately. I didn't, I mean, I can't tell you, I mean, I felt so out of place. I understood it was a momentous moment, and I wondered why a nice young Jewish guy from in the construction business was sitting there in the center of all of this, and they got up and they left, and that was the beginning of the city fiscal crisis.
And New York City, unlike cities here, well, some cities are like this, was dependent on short-term borrowings for its cash flow.
That's absolutely right.
To finance its operating expenditures.
What had happened was, about 8 years earlier, the mayor went to Governor Rockefeller and said, I need more state aid for New York City to balance my budget. And Rockefeller said, I don't have any money to give you, but I'm going to make it easier for you to borrow. And he changed the state law by permitting the city to borrow against the mayor's estimate of the revenues they would be receiving in the subsequent year, instead of limiting the borrowing to what they had actually received the year before. And every year the city sold more 12-month paper in amounts sufficient to pay off the previous year's notes and enough to cover the deficits. So there was absolutely no way the city of New York could avoid bankruptcy unless it converted all of these short-term notes into long-term paper.
And were all the most basic services at risk? In other words, everything, police, fire, street.
Yeah, and there were 9 months of negotiations in which services were cut. The state agreed to assume the cost of a lot of city services. The banks agreed to exchange their notes for long-term bonds, and union pension funds agreed to buy those bonds. And ultimately, President Ford in November got, with a 4-vote margin in the House, got a bill enacted which provided the city some financial aid, some loans. And then city worked its way out of it. But it was a situation in which everybody compromised. Everybody did the very thing that they'd said the week before they would never do. And we avoided bankruptcy. And to all of us, that was most important, because if we'd been forced to file bankruptcy, it would have been an admission that democracy can't solve a problem like this. But the most significant thing we did was, and I'm probably talking too long, David, the most significant thing we did was require the city to budget in accordance with generally accepted accounting principles. That is, that their recurring revenues had to match their recurring expenditures. And the city of New York has never had a fiscal crisis since then. And that is why all the other cities and states are in so much trouble, because they have borrowed billions of dollars to cover operating deficits, which by definition is not a sustainable course. Now, as David and his colleagues have pointed out, what happens in a place like California, where the holder they could keep on borrowing because the bondholder has a first lien on all the revenues, and there's plenty of revenues, the coverage is very significant. But what happens is that all the social services and education spending and infrastructure investments get killed in the process.
Let me just, this is why in California over the last 7 years, even though revenues are up and tax rates are up for about 30% at the state level, state spending on virtually every service is down. State spending on welfare is down more than 20%. State spending on UC and CSU is down more than 20%. State spending on courts is down about 40%. And the reason is because state spending on pensions, retiree health care, salaries, Medicaid, and debt service are all up. So increases in revenues are going to other things, and these other programs are being crowded out. And this is happening, obviously, to a very significant scale in cities as well, we're going to go to Detroit in a second, but in cities like San Jose, there are a couple of people here from San Jose tonight, which is not declared bankruptcy, but they, like a lot of cities, have ended up cutting back services dramatically. Like San Jose, I think, has a chart that shows how its spending for its police department went from $75 million a year to about $250 million a year over a 10-year period, yet staffing in that department dropped from X to Y. The number of officers went down even though spending was up, and that's because the city was spending so much more on retirement benefits and that sort of thing. You can write that large nationally for a lot of local and state governments. We're going to come back to Detroit in just a second, but before we get there, in San Francisco, we had a sick out this last week. The San Francisco Muni System, which is the equivalent of the Metropolitan Transit Authority in New York, Transportation Authority in New York, they don't have the right to strike, but they had a sick out. And so there was reduced service on Monday and Tuesday. I don't know if it extended into Wednesday. Governor Perry, after saving the city of New York, asked you to become chairman of the Metropolitan Transit Agency. Tell us about that and include the part about the bulletproof vest.
Well, he asked me. I obviously care a lot about public service, and my first reaction was to say to him, "Are you out of your mind? I ride the subways, Governor, and you don't." But and they were in terrible shape. But I agreed to do it, and I first had a strike of the Long Island Railroad, and then 6 months later, the contract with the subway workers, 45,000 workers, was up, and there was a tradition: no contract, no work. And there was it was needless to say, in a city like New York, that was the headline for the previous month. I think you were there then, Amy, weren't you? And Koch was the mayor, and he had done a terrific job in bringing New York out of the near bankruptcy just a few years earlier. And he wanted to make sure that the transit workers didn't get a big increase because it would set a precedent for the city, and his negotiations were coming up a few months later. So he was constantly in the press saying, "Watch, keep your eye on Ravitch, he's going to give away the store," and all of that. And the governor didn't want a strike under any circumstances. And the contract expiration was on April 1st, 1980. That April 1st was the first night of Passover. And I always had the family Seder. And the governor's son was the banquet manager at the St. Regis Hotel. And he decided that a way to solve everything was he had his son arrange to cater a Seder at the St. Regis Hotel for Mayor Koch and me, just the two of us. And Carrie's son told me afterwards, and still loves to tell the story, that it was the first time that anybody had made matzo ball soup in the kitchen at the St. Regis Hotel.
Without a doubt.
It was a very unsuccessful Seder, and there was a strike, and Koch used to attack me with regularity, but we were very good friends nonetheless, and he was a great mayor. And I had an extraordinary time, 4 years. There were 2 attempts on my life. So I had to wear a bulletproof vest when I was in public, which was very, very uncomfortable. But I got a lot of satisfaction I got laws passed in Washington and New York and raised about $14 billion to start the rebuilding of the public transportation system in New York.
So, by the way, you ran MTA in 1982, right?
Yeah.
Because my wife and I lived there that summer, and we had a lot of complaints about subway service that month, or that
Well,
that
the new
summer.
cars hadn't
I wish
come
I
in
had
yet.
known. Yeah, the new car showed up later.
Right.
So after
It takes
all,
a few years, David, to manufacture them.
after all that, you then ran for mayor. Tell us about that. And what year was that?
89.
89. All right.
Well, there's only one Ravitch who's ever been successful at running for office, and she's here tonight, the district attorney in Sonoma County. I was an abysmal candidate. I didn't know Jill then, and therefore I couldn't learn the magic of being a good candidate. I was a terrible candidate, but I have to tell you, it was an extraordinary experience. I loved it. I was exhausting. I was at subway stations at 5:30 every morning. I found the people to be civil and polite and genuine and curious, and I do everything I can to encourage good people. And if I'm ever asked to sum up my book, I say read the first quote in the beginning of the book, which is from Plato, which says, if you're not prepared to engage in politics, you deserve to be governed by inferior people. But I have no regrets about it, and I hope Jill runs for governor one of these days. I'm going to come out and campaign for her.
I'm for that, Jill. So after, so I've got two more questions for you, and then we're going to open it up for the audience. After various business activities, including entering the financial services business with Larry Tisch and Warren Buffett, and engaging in the baseball labor negotiations, in 2009 you were appointed Lieutenant Governor of New York. Tell us briefly about that experience. And
it was the least useful period in my entire life. Lieutenant governors have no function, and I used the opportunity to learn a lot about how states budgeted. And what I learned, I was very unhappy about, because they were all doing the very thing that we prohibited the city of New York from ever doing in 1975. And by sheer serendipity, one of my stepdaughter's best friends worked at the Federal Reserve Bank. And as a result, I got to meet and they asked to sequester her to my office so that she could learn something about New York State budgeting. And as a result, I met the leadership of the New York Fed, who had an appalling lack of ignorance, or lack of knowledge rather, of how states and cities budget. And so I got fascinated with the question and began to understand that other states and cities were on unsustainable courses, that infrastructure spending was way down, higher spending on higher public education, and they had 3 kids in public universities for every one in a private university. Spending on pre-K education was way down. And retirement obligations and healthcare expenses were rising much, much faster than revenues. And that this was ultimately going to lead to what we now see unfolding. So that's when Paul Volcker and I raised a few $1 million from foundations and conducted the study that, which David was very much a key part of, and as was George Shultz and Joe Califano and Nick Brady, who you may remember had been Secretary of the Treasury in the Bush years, Bush 1. We had quite a good group of people.
Alice Rivlin.
Alice Rivlin had been the budget director in the Clinton years. And we issued some very, I think, thoughtful and constructive reports, which never got as much attention as we would have liked, because the appetite for politicians to kick the can down the road is so voracious in appetite that we haven't even begun to see the problems we're going to see down the line. And Wall Street continues to lend money if the rating agencies put the right letter on it. You know, and we're just accumulating a vast amount of debt, and we don't have the resources to meet our obligations.
Well, this is what, so my last question is going to be about solutions. This is what drew Dick and me together when Paul and I spoke, and then I got connected with Dick. And then I worked with Dick and Paul and the others on the State Budget Crisis Task Force report. It was because of my own experience as special advisor to Governor Schwarzenegger. And anybody who has ever been in the private sector, including the nonprofit sector, who goes into state or local government and has, so if you have a background in something different than state or local government, you're sort of blown away by what you discover. And I think this is one of the things Dick discovered as Lieutenant Governor of New York. They don't budget or account for things the way anybody else does. And the net consequence, that can get very boring, putting it that way. No one wants to talk about budgets, and no one wants to talk about accounting. But the consequences are that innocent people get hurt in very significant ways that are not visible for years. And it's a little bit like a frog slowly being boiled to death. That's how I describe California. Many people will say today, or New York State, you know, that they're coming back because their revenues are up. But nobody's really paying attention to that, to the fact that welfare spending is down, or that California has a 25% poverty rate, or the tuition has tripled at the University of California over the last 10 years, and at California State University. And as Dick said, you ain't seen nothing yet. Warren Buffett wrote about this in his most recent annual letter, where he ended the annual letter with commentary on the tapeworm that is pension costs and what that tapeworm is consuming government services. And the most vulnerable citizens are the ones who are hurt. Students, people who use courts. Catherine Feinstein, who I think just quit as the presiding judge here in San Francisco, commented that there's really no due process in the San Francisco court system now because, among other things, people have to pay for their own court reporters, regardless of their income, which is, you know, undoubtedly a due process issue. So you have, and then you have escalating costs for public transportation that people depend on, and then you have all these problems, and they're largely hidden from people, largely because of this accounting issue. And it's not sexy. So it's not like you can say, damn this corporation for hurting this, you know, planet, or these poor people, or something like that. State and local governments, which provide the lion's share of domestic services in the United States. There are nearly 20 million state and local employees. There are only something like 3 million federal employees. State and local governments really touch people's lives, and no one really pays attention to it. So that leads me to my question, which is, how, if at all, do we solve these problems before bankruptcy? Because, you know, one of the things about bankruptcy in Detroit, by that time, most of the damage has already been done to citizens. They've already lost their libraries, their community centers, a lot of their public safety, et cetera, et cetera. So what's the solution?
Well, let me say that the most fascinating thing about Detroit is that for the last 55 years, every economic and demographic indicator has been down. And despite that, they have $18 billion of debt. Why people lent money when they had no capacity to repay is beyond me. And why they made promises to employees that they did not have the ability to honor is beyond me. And this is happening all over the country. And I think the remedy, very simply, is what we did in New York City in 1975. You've got to require, you must require state and city governments to budget in accordance with GAAP. They have to use the system of accounting that everybody in business uses. So you can't defer paying an obligation until the first day of the following year and avoid having it be a charge against the budget in this year. And if everybody was required to do that, you would not have these fiscal crises. Now, What does that mean? That means that services probably would have to come down at some level, and it means that taxes probably would have to go up. But that's far better than kicking the can down the road to the tune of the trillions upon trillions of dollars that we've done that amongst 50 states and thousands of cities in this country. And it never happened before. You know, there was no collective bargaining until the 60s. There were no public pension funds of any significance really until the 70s. And there wasn't health care costs of the dimension that Medicaid represents today. I mean, all these things are now consume an average 50% of state budgets, and they didn't
Medicaid
exist
is a
30
larger
years ago.
expenditure now than education, right?
That's correct. And
For states.
and we just were not honest enough with ourselves about how we were going to pay to keep those promises.
Well, on that note, we'd love to have questions or commentary from any of you for Dick.
Okay.
On that point, is there any group or organization who would take upon them to start doing gap accounting and publicize it?
Well, there's something called the Government Accounting Standards Board, but they have no jurisdiction over budgeting. They do have arguably something to say about how the audited financial statements of local governments should be reported. A few years ago, the head of GASB proposed that the states should be required to show 4-year projections of their expenses and revenues. And he asked me to testify at a GASB hearing, which I did. I was followed by the National Governors Association and the U.S. Conference of Mayors, who testified against it, because the last thing they want is more transparency. It limits their ability to fool people and the rating agencies, frankly.
Let me add.
And it's also important to understand that the SEC does not have jurisdiction over the issuance of municipal securities. The only role they have is in the event of fraud, the fraud provisions under the 34 Act. But there is a lot of reconsideration of that going on in Washington. I'm very involved in that. There was recently one member of the SEC announced that the unreported liabilities from these unfunded pension systems is not being adequately disclosed in the issuance of municipal bonds around the country, and he is suggesting that that should be a subject of serious SEC inquiry.
Let me just add, just to put it in perspective, state and local governments spend $3.2 trillion a year in the United States, and they are not required to budget under any particular standards. And so just to give you an example of that, and Governor Schwarzenegger was guilty of this as well, under the standards that they can choose to use, they can treat borrowings as revenue. Now, nobody else can do that. JCC can't do it. You can't do it in your businesses. Governments can treat borrowings as revenue. Governments can also avoid reporting a cost simply by not paying it. So
I'll tell you the best story of all. I had called shortly after Rahm Emanuel was elected mayor in Chicago. I had coffee with him one day, and he said to me, he said, you know what my predecessor did? He hocked 75 years of parking revenues, used the proceeds to balance his last budget, and has left the city of Chicago without any parking meters at all. New York sold Attica Prison to itself and leased it back, has since paid $400 million of interest to have received $200 million to balance their budget 18 years ago. Arizona sold its state capital and leased it back, used the proceeds to balance its budget. This is going on all over the country. It is not sustainable.
Well, California securitized all its tobacco revenues in 1 year, but Governor Davis did, and used those to balance their budget 1 year.
The next question's here in the back.
Dick, you've recently engaged in Detroit. Can you just give us a few thoughts about Detroit and how can it possibly resolve itself, the current situations, and still not be a problem in the future?
Well, I'm somewhat constrained in being too specific because my role in Detroit is simply to advise the governor, the bankruptcy judge rather, about the feasibility of the plan that ultimately gets finalized in the next few weeks. Suffice it to say that there are a lot of very, very good people who are trying very hard to adjust the limited resources equitably amongst the various creditors, whether they're money creditors or retirees. And there are people in both categories who don't think that the current plan is fair and equitable, and a lot of that will be litigated. Some of it will not be resolved until long afterwards. There was the state of Michigan passed a law under which the governor could appoint somebody called a manager who therefore assumed all the powers of being mayor. And Governor Snyder appointed a lawyer from the Jones Day firm, a very, very able guy, who de facto has been running the city of Detroit. There was a mayor elected in the normal course who will only take power if the bankruptcy plan is, ultimately confirmed by the judge. Do I think that a bankruptcy plan can work if the creditors ultimately accept, either as a result of consensual agreements or litigation? Yeah, I think that, interestingly enough, that the very tragedy of Detroit contains the seeds of its revitalization. When you look at the statistics about population growth in the United States, and most of that's going to occur in the major cities, you have these 125 acres in downtown Detroit, which I don't know whether it's been reported much in the San Francisco papers, but been all over the front page of the New York Times.
Goats.
It's devastated, and yet there's a street system, there's a sewer system, there's a water system, there's power grid, and all of a sudden, young people are beginning to find that it's the cheapest possible housing in a metropolitan area because the land is worthless. So those are the seeds for rebuilding, and it's the same reason why you've seen parts of Brooklyn gentrified in New York. I think all of us have kids who live there and who can't afford the rents in Manhattan, in places that 20 years ago I wouldn't have been caught dead walking at night, or I would have been dead if I'd walked there at night. And so I think there's a shot. If the bankruptcy plan does not go through, I think it would be a tragedy. Whether it's this one or a modified one is something I can't comment on.
Next question's back here. I'll get to the rest of you.
Sure. So the quote I think you stated from Plato was, if you refuse to engage in politics, then you deserve to be governed by the inferior, right? So just recently, on Tuesday, we had, I think, the lowest turnout in California history, 18% in the primary. What do you, I don't know if New York is going through the same kind of phenomena. Do you think it's apathy that citizens are feeling? Are they feeling helpless? Why is it that if they are the ones that theoretically have the power to displace the inferior, why do they choose to not do so?
You know, I know this very bright young lady who asked this question, and I can only say you probably have a better idea of what the answer, Autumn, is than I do. But I have to tell you that it's a very sad thing. It comes about from cynicism, a conviction that it doesn't matter who they elect, that every politician in the final analysis is the same. And I think it relates to the fact that the disincentives for people to go into politics have just piled up. The invasions of privacy, the fact that for a bright young person, the opportunities in the commercial world or the legal world are so great compared to what they are in government. Term limits, I happen to think, discourages from people from making careers in politics. So the disincentives pile up. I know at one point one of my kids was asked to go to work in the Treasury Department, and I said that I would help him out financially because his young wife was pregnant at the time, and he said, "I appreciate that, Dad, but and I respect your love of public service." He said, "But if I don't hack it in my 30s, I'm never going to have an opportunity to do so again. And I don't want to be called names, and I don't want people snooping around in my private life." I'm sad to say that's fairly typical. So it's a combination of voters feeling that their vote doesn't make much difference, but that is part due to the fact that it's very hard to get good people to run.
It's particularly ironic, though, with such a low turnout, their votes make an enormous difference. And so if there's a time to do it, it's now. And I'm a little bit harsher about this than Dick is. I think most Americans take democracy for granted. They had a 60% turnout in India, 550 million votes, and completely changed their government. So Americans need to do the same thing.
You touched on the subject of affordable housing, and I use the word affordable rather than low income because that's the phrase that's used here in San Francisco. One of the problems that is will be a tremendous problem if something isn't done, the whole healthcare system in terms of the workers. What's happening is obviously doctors and nurses can be fairly well paid, but there will be more and more people needed as caretakers for those people that are trying to continue to live at home. How has New York, have they found a way in terms of the immediacy, being on a peninsula? My newspaper man has a little business, and he already commented he's lost his helpers at the newspaper place because they say it's too far to commute in, and they can't afford the housing any longer to live in the city.
40% of all Medicaid expenditures are made for people who are already on Medicare. So that's true nationally. In New York, we probably spend at least $2 billion a year on home care for people. And it's a very expensive solution, but not to do it would be inhuman, I think. But I mean, that says nothing more than reflect my own values, but people could honorably disagree. But we have a very significant home care program, as I think most jurisdictions do, to deal with the fact that, and this is one of the reasons, obviously, why everything David and I talk about is true, is that people are living longer. And that's one of the reasons why these pension systems are not adequately funded.
I just want to add one more thing, though, because currently, one of the problems, obviously, now with our muni system, talking about pensions and their sicken was called supposedly because they want whatever the automatic increases to be in salary, as well as the pension benefits, and yet they were quoted, if it's true, as being the third highest paid people in the country.
Yeah. San Francisco Muni.
I mean, you stated the part of the problem very clearly.
So how do you put your foot down in terms of the government itself?
It's who you elect. We believe in collective bargaining. Unions negotiate the terms and conditions of their employment. If politicians give more than they can afford and then are unwilling to tax to pay for them, that's why we're in trouble. So they can't have it both ways. Either they've got to pay less or impose greater requirements for people employed by the government.
But
or
it's
else
who
they
you
have to
elect.
tax.
For a
But
citizen,
it
it's who
comes
you
down to
elect.
who you elect. That's right.
There's another question over here.
Yes, thank you. Those of us who are concerned about the future, our children, our grandchildren, sit back and look and see, I think the apathy has to be that doesn't really matter who you vote for, or at least it hasn't appeared to. And I know, David, you're doing a lot of very, very good work in trying to provide a new paradigm and to find people who do make a difference in what they do. So the question is, because there's something in this country where if we see a need, whether it's a neighbor that has a fire or there's a tragedy, the outpouring of help and support is almost over the top. But how do we establish an ability and a connection between what I do as an individual, what I do in my community, and the good of the whole? If you have any thoughts on that, either of you.
Let me
Well-
let me go first. Let me just say that I think elected representatives reflect exactly what it is you just described. And there are two big reforms that we passed in the Schwarzenegger administration, which are designed to make those elected representatives reflect the will of the people, not the extremes. We passed independently drawn districts. We have independently drawn districts instead of gerrymandering, and open primary. And so you'll now notice there are a lot of races now in the general election. They're Democrat on Democrat or Republican on Republican, and that's designed to have people people that reflect their interests more. I cannot think, there are only 121 people who govern the entire state of California. This year they will spend $240 billion and oversee the education of 9 million students and incarcerate almost 200,000 people, consider 5,000 bills, pass 1,000 of those bills. They will determine whether courts are funded, parks are funded, all those sorts of things. They'll effectively determine what tuition is for students, et cetera. I cannot think of a better way to translate what you just said than to find someone you really think is good and give them money, because that's how they win. And it doesn't take very much, and it doesn't take very many votes. I mean, my organization, we just had 7 elections. My organization is called Govern for California. We had 7 elections on Tuesday. We won 4 of them. So we have 4 people advancing to the general election. Those 4 people, when they win, will have an enormous amount of influence on the margin in the state legislature.
To put it in a more generalized context, the reason I'm not pessimistic is because I've lived long enough to see this country overcome a depression, win a world war, end 150 years of segregation, beat the Russians in a tough, competitive war. And what we face today is how do we get everybody to agree to put our resources and our obligations in balance. And that is so much easier a task than the things that we've accomplished. I have to believe that we will. And I think the way to get there faster is to elect better people. And I think that as the problems get worse and worse and people recognize there are no fairy godmothers in the wings, and nobody's going to be throwing lots of gold bullion down from heaven, they're going to begin to recognize they're going to have to give up a lot. And people will stop lending money that can't be repaid. There will be some self-generated discipline, because what's at stake is the fabric of our democracy. And I really believe that to be true. And I don't think we're going to give that up.
You've focused pretty much here on this discussion and the liabilities to Medicare, Medicaid, or pensions, et cetera. What are the subsidies for, shall we say, ballparks or
For what?
The
Ballparks.
subsidies for the building of ballparks, soccer stadiums, often to draw business into a city where we say, oh, no taxes for 25 years or whatever, do they not draw also
Well,
tax revenues?
that's a very, very good question. And there was a report issued recently that says states provide $80 billion of tax credits to businesses in order to induce them to stay in the state where they are or to get them to move to other states. That is an absurd thing. We are one nation with one set of values. We happen to have a federal system. I mean, the Boeing company wanted to move to North Carolina to avoid the labor laws of the state of Washington. The state of Washington wrote a check, taxpayer money, for what I think was $10 billion. I may not have the number correctly, in order to get them not to move. New York State gives $1 billion of tax credits to movie companies to make movies in New York. Well, every state offers the same tax credits. They make movies in New York because New York is a place where it's attractive to make movies because people go see movies which have New York as a backdrop. It's absolutely absurd.
It's a race. It's a terrible race to the bottom.
And it's increasing, and I'm so glad you brought it up. It's a terrible, terrible thing, but governors want to try to get people to move into their state or not move out, and they do it with legal bribes.
The biggest battles I had with Governor Schwarzenegger were over these issues, because I was adamantly opposed to every incentive. And governors love to give, he was in the movie business. I once had him convinced not to do the motion picture tax credit. And the next day he was back to saying he's going to do the motion picture tax. Every governor likes to do that. He got, as Carla knows, he got incredibly upset with me when Tesla was trying to get money from the state of California to build their factory here, and I turned him down. So they went to New Mexico, where Bill Richardson, who was then governor, gave him $35 million. That's a state of 1.5 million people. He promised him $35 million for maybe 400 jobs. And Governor Schwarzenegger was really angry at that because it gets bad press. People say, why is Tesla going down there, right? Now, they ended up having to come back here, and they still got $10 million in the state of California. That's another reason you want to elect representatives who won't do that stuff.
The next question's here in the front.
Hi, it's actually a question for both of you. So I wonder if you'd comment on the troika of democracy, civil service, and collective bargaining.
I'd be glad to. It's something I've given a lot of thought to since I have a good relationship with the labor movement. I think that to roll the clock back, as some states have done, to limit the ability of people to bargain for the terms of their employment is wrong. I don't think you can change that fundamental right that everybody else has, because part of the challenge here is to get good people into public service. And as David said, there are 19 million people who work for states and cities. But that's not the equivalent of saying that politicians necessarily ought to do what the unions want. And the real answer to that is public financing of elections. David and I don't agree on that, but I happen to believe, I chaired a charter revision commission for the city of New York and wrote the first public campaign finance law that's ever been enforced in the United States in New York City. And it's worked, with the exception of when you have a millionaire because of a Supreme Court decision many years ago, Buckley v. Vallejo, the right of a wealthy individual to spend whatever they want was protected as a First Amendment issue. But other than that, money does not influence the elections in New York City because everybody participates in public campaign finance.
Take two more questions.
I have a question about unfunded obligations for state governments and city governments. I was wondering how that's going to manifests itself in the public markets and on Wall Street, and all the fact that there's no way these are like small Greek defaults that are going to come up, and they're massive.
Well, I think there are a lot of unresolved questions. Litigation is going on right now in many places around the country. I think the most interesting decision that's coming up very soon is in connection with the bankruptcy of Stockton, where this very issue as to the prioritization of obligations is at least going to be resolved at that level. There are all kinds of risks here. I can't help but tell you an interesting story. One of the things we did to get President Ford to help New York City was to pass a moratorium on the payment of all of the interest on the city's outstanding notes. We passed that in the fall of 1975 with the consent of the banks. The highest court in the state ultimately said that that law was unconstitutional, that New York had to use its constitutional taxing power to meet its obligations. And if that's the case, then the risk of incurring a lot of debt is confiscatory levels of taxation. There was a federal court of the state of Arkansas defaulted on bonds in the Depression, and the federal courts ultimately made them enact taxes in amounts sufficient to repay it. So whether a general obligation bond, full faith and credit obligation of a city or state government is going to be upheld no matter what, depends in part as to whether the courts will force governments to raise taxes.
But let me
this is important. Under our system, our constitutional system, states can't file bankruptcy.
They can file bankruptcy?
Cannot. The 11th Amendment to the Constitution prohibits the federal courts from having a jurisdiction over a lawsuit between the citizen of one state and another state, and by definition, that's what bankruptcy is. But cities can. So cities can if states authorize it. And 31 states have laws that authorize municipalities to file bankruptcy. So we're going to have very mixed results with respect to the question that you raise for quite some time to come, I'm afraid. And Congress wants to duck it. I remember, I'll just tell you one cute thing. I was giving a speech on this subject, and somebody said to me, well, the implications of what you're saying, Mr. Ravitch, is that taxes are going to have to go up. But if taxes go up, we're all going to move to Nevada. And I said, well, that's marvelous. That means you'll have to build a subway in Las Vegas, and we'll have 2 more Senate votes for federal aid to mass transit.
Last question back here.
Hi. Our governor has abolished the redevelopment agency, which had been a way in which to finance urban renewal and stuff. So what are the new models for public partnerships with government, or what would you recommend we do with some of the assets that now have to be turned over or transferred to another governance model, like around our convention center here in San Francisco?
I'm not familiar with what's happened in California, forgive me. I don't think the model changes necessarily. I think that there are plenty of things where government can use public land, put it in the ownership of public benefit corporations, lease it at levels that produce desirable economic activity, and partner with businesses to do things that are useful. I remember, God, I forget, I used to know the name of the guy who ran the urban renewal program in San Francisco many years ago. Anybody remember his name back in the 60s? Wonderful
Dick,
guy.
we don't remember any names from the 60s.
Sorry. And, but that program's dead. And that was a federally financed program, but where the responsibility was with the states. So I think the model is public benefit corporations that are run as independent agencies that pursue statutory goals, and where you can bring business in any one of a number of ways, because ultimately it's only through private business that you're going to have any economic growth in this society.
I want to remind you that Richard Ravitch will be signing his book in the atrium. Thanks so much to all of you for being here. Mostly thanks to David and Richard. Thank you.